Down on the ground! Hands where we can see them! The shout cracked through the air, sharp and brutal. John Whitaker dropped the wrench he had been holding, raising his grease-stained hands slowly. Before he could even turn, heavy boots rushed in, shoving him hard against the concrete floor of his own workshop. The ground was cold and rough against his cheek. Plastic zip ties tightened around his wrists, slicing into skin already thinned by years. "Wrong place," John tried to say, his voice calm despite the chaos. But no one listened. Weapons pointed at him like accusations. Through the blur of adrenaline and dust, he saw the black SUVs blocking the driveway, agents in tactical gear spilling out like a flood. They didn't know who he was. To them, he was just another old man in a town too small to make headlines. Not the soldier who had once navigated war zones forgotten even by history. Not the man who had buried friends in places no maps would ever mark. "Subject secured!" someone shouted into a radio. The agent's boot pressed harder into John's back as they scanned the workshop for threats that weren't there. John gritted his teeth but stayed still. Years ago, he had learned that survival sometimes meant knowing when not to fight. The workshop smelled of diesel, sawdust, and the faint metallic bite of blood. Somewhere, he realized distantly, he had cut his lip on the fall. In the battered drawer beneath his old workbench, under oil-stained rags and broken carburetors, were the only medals he had ever kept, buried, forgotten, just like the life he had chosen to leave behind. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. John twisted his head just enough to see the familiar rattle-trap pickup truck pulling into the driveway. Susan. Her silhouette climbed out, small and unaware, grocery bags balanced in her arms. A flash of panic sliced through John, sharper than any blade. "No!" he muttered, but the word was lost in the storm. Agents swiveled toward her, weapons raised. "Drop the bags! Hands where we can see them!" Susan froze, confusion painting her face, groceries slipping from her grasp. One bag hit the ground, apples rolling under the truck, a carton of eggs bursting open in a wet splatter. John struggled against the cuffs. "She's my wife!" he shouted. "She's not a threat!" A boot pinned him harder to the ground. "Stay down, old man!" Susan lifted her hands as best she could, trembling. John watched helplessly as the chaos he had seen too often in faraway places unfolded now in his own backyard, on his own soil, against the only person who had stayed through it all. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows that made everything sharper, crueler. John squeezed his eyes shut, blocking out the scene for a heartbeat. When he opened them again, he knew there would be no battlefield today, no counterattack, no rescue coming, only dignity, only the truth he still carried, even when the world forgot. And soon they would learn who they had just trampled, not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet, unstoppable gravity of a man who never stopped serving, even when no one was watching. The agents moved with mechanical precision, clearing the small shop as if John Whitaker were a threat they had trained years to neutralize. Boots pounded on the concrete. The clatter of tools kicked aside. Shouts layered over radio chatter. Pressed flat against the floor, wrists zip-tied behind his back, John remained silent. He had seen enough operations to know. Words would do nothing right now. Only patience. Only control. Above him, one agent barked into a radio. "Subject secured. Moving to breach the residence." Residence? John wanted to tell them the only thing behind the shop was a storage shed and a garden his wife tended every spring. No house, no hidden basement, no crime. But he said nothing. Not yet. A heavy boot stepped near his head, scattering bits of gravel and dirt. Another pair of agents rushed past him into the rear of the workshop, barking again. "Clear! Nothing!" That's when he heard it. The familiar rattle of Susan's pickup coming down the gravel drive. "No," he murmured, almost inaudible. The vehicle rolled into view, old shocks squeaking, as Susan pulled into her usual spot by the side door. She stepped out, grocery bags balanced in both arms, a soft smile on her face. She hadn't seen them yet. Hadn't seen the chaos. "John?" she called, blinking at the sight of black-clad figures surrounding the workshop. Several agents turned on her instantly, weapons snapping up like iron drawn to a magnet. "Drop the bags! Hands where we can see them!" Susan froze, instinctively clutching the paper bags tighter against her chest. I just," she stammered, trying to process the scene unfolding before her. "Ma'am, drop them now!" One young agent shouted again, panic tightening his voice. John lifted his head slightly from the concrete, struggling against the cuffs. "She's not a threat," he called out, voice firm but restrained. "That's my wife. She's just—" A boot pressed harder into his back, cutting him off. "Stay down!" barked another agent. Susan, still frozen, tried to lower the grocery bags gently, but her fingers trembled. One bag slipped, smashing against the driveway, apples scattering across the gravel, a carton of eggs bursting open in a wet slap. "Non-compliant subject!" a voice snapped. "No!" John shouted, but it was too late. One of the younger agents surged forward, his taser drawn but hesitating for a split second. Then, without clear threat, without true danger, he shoved Susan hard. The force sent her sprawling backward. Her head struck the edge of the truck's bumper before she collapsed heavily onto the gravel. The bags burst open fully, groceries tumbling into the dirt. A bottle of milk rolled, leaking a thin white trail across the stones. Time seemed to stutter. John's breath caught in his chest. The workshop, the light, the smell of diesel and hay, all of it faded into a tight, aching silence inside his mind. Susan lay motionless, one hand twisted awkwardly under her body. The young agent stepped back, weapon still raised, face flushed with adrenaline and fear. He hadn't seen a threat. He'd seen an old woman moving too slowly, and he had reacted in panic. John closed his eyes briefly, fighting every survival instinct, screaming for action. If he moved wrong now, it would only get worse. He turned his head to the side, pressing his cheek against the cold concrete to see her. Her gray hair fanned out against the dusty ground, groceries scattered like the aftermath of a storm. "Please," John said, voice low, trembling not with fear but with fury held tight in a steel grip. "Someone check on her." No one moved at first. It would take another minute, a minute that felt like an hour, before one of the senior agents realized the gravity of what had just happened, before anyone thought to lower their weapons, before anyone really saw, what they had done. And John, lying there cuffed and powerless, understood something he hadn't felt since the worst days overseas. Sometimes the battlefield wasn't across an ocean. Sometimes it came home. John Whitaker lay still on the concrete, the sting of plastic cuffs biting deeper into his wrists with every shallow breath. Around him, agents buzzed like hornets, shouts, radios, rapid footsteps. But none approached Susan. She hadn't moved. John opened his eyes fully, locking onto the boots of the nearest squad leader. His voice, when it came, was steady but stripped bare of anything but command. "Your operation leader. Now." The agent hesitated, glancing toward a man standing further back. Older, heavy-set, marked with the insignia of a senior field agent. That was the one in charge. John raised his voice only enough to carry, "Check my left inside jacket pocket. Do it carefully." The squad leader barked an order. One of the agents, gloved and tense, approached John warily. He patted down John's jacket and retrieved a small battered leather case. Opening it, he found two things: a worn military retirement ID card issued by the Department of Defense, a letter of commendation, folded and creased from years of being carried, bearing the unmistakable signature of General Nathan Brooks, former commander of the United States Special Operations Command. The young agent's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what he was holding, but he knew enough to realize it was above his pay grade. The squad leader snatched the documents, scanning them quickly. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, from aggressive to uncertain. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. John didn't raise his head. He didn't need to. "John Whitaker," he said quietly. "U.S. Army, Special Forces, retired." He let the words settle for a beat before adding, "Call Commander Brooks, retired. He'll tell you everything you need to know." The squad leader hesitated, glancing at the field agent in charge. There was a flicker of tension between them, a silent conversation exchanged through looks alone. The field agent finally muttered into his radio, low and fast. Within moments, a secondary team member peeled away to their vehicle, tapping frantically into a database. John didn't move. He lay there on the ground, the sun slipping lower, a thin bead of sweat tracing a path along his temple. His mind wasn't on himself. It was on Susan, still lying there, and on the awful truth he knew from experience. Sometimes authority didn't listen until it was forced to. Seconds dragged, then minutes. A tense murmur began to ripple through the squad. Someone cursed under their breath. Another radioed in, voice pitched too low for John to hear, but the fragments that carried over the static made it clear. They had made a mistake, a big one. John finally lifted his head a fraction, locking eyes with the squad leader. "Help my wife," he said, voice flat but edged with steel. The leader hesitated again, but the decision was no longer his to make. Another agent, older, less rigid, knelt cautiously by Susan's side. He checked her pulse, touched her shoulder lightly, then turned and called for the medic team, his voice tight. At last, movement. At last, recognition that something had gone very, very wrong. John let his head rest against the concrete again, exhaling a slow breath. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't fought back. He had just stood his ground without standing up, and forced them, with dignity alone, to see what they had refused to see before. And for the first time since the SUVs had skidded into his world, John Whitaker allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to put things right. The dark SUV rolled into the driveway without sirens or flashing lights, just the deliberate hum of an engine at idle. Agents shifted uneasily, stepping back from John Whitaker as the vehicle came to a halt. From the driver's side stepped a man in a charcoal gray suit, moving with the quiet authority of someone long accustomed to command. His hair was silver, cropped regulation short, and his presence turned the heavy afternoon air even heavier. John lifted his head slightly, recognition flashing through the exhaustion clouding his mind. General Nathan Brooks, retired, but still a name that carried weight in places where decisions lived and died in silence. The field agent in charge hurried forward, words tumbling from his mouth in explanation, apology, confusion. Brooks raised a hand, not abrupt, not hostile, but final. The field agent stopped mid-sentence, swallowed hard, and stepped aside. Brooks crossed the distance to John slowly, his polished shoes crunching the loose gravel. He stopped 2 feet away from where John still lay on the ground, wrists bound, face lined with dirt and sweat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, with careful precision, General Brooks removed his suit jacket, folded it neatly over one arm, and, standing tall in full view of the assembled agents, saluted John Whitaker. A crisp, formal salute, rendered without hesitation. Every conversation around them stopped. Radios fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. John struggled into a sitting position, the cuffs still biting his wrists. He returned the salute, slow, deliberate, despite the ache in his shoulders. Brooks leaned down, his voice low but carrying in the sudden stillness. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, dropping the military formality without losing a shred of respect. "You don't deserve to be on the ground. Not today. Not ever." He turned to the field agent. "Cut him loose. Now." No one hesitated this time. The plastic restraints were sliced away in seconds, and John flexed his hands, the blood returning in hot, painful tingles. Brooks extended a hand. John hesitated only a fraction of a second before taking it. He rose to his feet slowly, wincing slightly, but standing tall. "Medics checking your wife," Brooks said, his voice gentler now. "She's conscious. No serious injuries." John nodded once, a short, sharp motion. Brooks turned back to the assembled DEA team. "You came here on bad intel. You acted with adrenaline instead of judgment," Brooks said. "You didn't just raid a suspect's home. You stormed the property of a man who served with distinction most of you will never comprehend, a man who still carries battles you'll never see." The young agent who had shoved Susan earlier stood stiff and pale, eyes locked on the ground. Brooks pointed at him, no anger in his tone, just cold finality. "Badge, weapon, now." Without a word, the young man removed his tactical vest, sidearm, and credentials, placing them carefully on the hood of the nearest vehicle. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. No one stopped him. No one said a word. Brooks faced John again, quieter now. "I came because you mattered then. You still matter now." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken without grand speeches. He only glanced toward Susan, who now sat upright against a paramedic's knee, blinking dazedly but alive. And with that, the old soldier, who had never wanted to be a symbol, never asked for medals, never demanded respect, simply turned and walked to her side, leaving the weapons, the agents, the apologies, and the wreckage behind him. He knelt beside his wife, took her hand gently in his, and held it, steady and sure, until her fingers tightened back around his. Silent, unbreakable. The following days unfolded in a haze of slow healing. Susan spent 2 nights at Cedar Creek Memorial Hospital, kept under observation for the mild concussion and bruised ribs. John barely left her side, except to slip home briefly, feed the dog, and return with fresh clothes and a book she liked to hear him read aloud. The DEA issued a formal apology, a letter, typed and official, delivered by courier, and left unopened on the kitchen table. John didn't need it. Apologies weighed less than actions. Out in town, the shift was quiet but unmistakable. At the feed store, the clerk who once barely glanced at him now looked him in the eye and thanked him, voice steady. At the diner, where John and Susan sometimes shared breakfast, coffee arrived at their table unasked, paid for before they could reach for their wallets. Sheriff Carter, who had not been involved in the raid, made it a point to drive by the shop each morning, pausing just long enough to tip his hat respectfully. John accepted it all without comment. He neither basked in it nor rejected it. He simply continued, fixing old chainsaws, sharpening mower blades, helping neighbors get through the chores that tied their lives together. One evening, about a week after Susan came home, John found something resting quietly against the side door of his workshop. It was a piece of oak wood, sanded smooth, about 2 feet long. Burned into it by hand, the inscription read, "In honor of John Whitaker, quiet strength builds stronger worlds." No signature, no fanfare, just the words. John ran his fingers lightly over the letters, feeling the roughness of the grain beneath the clean precision of the carving. A simple thing, a thing that would last. He didn't tell Susan about it right away. He simply hung the plaque inside the shop, above the old workbench where the afternoon sun always hit hardest. There, between the battered tools and the scarred wood of his labor, it blended into the space like it had always belonged. Not because he needed the recognition, not because anyone demanded he remember, but because sometimes, in a world too loud with pride and anger, dignity spoke clearest in the places built by quiet hands. Days became weeks. Life settled back into a rhythm of simple routines and small kindnesses. The black SUVs never returned. The scars on Susan's ribs faded. The ache in John's wrists disappeared. But the understanding, the truth of what had been revealed, remained etched into the bones of Cedar Creek. And though John never spoke of that day again, everyone who had been there, the agents, the neighbors, even those who had only heard whispers, carried it forward, not as a scandal, not as a tragedy, as a reminder that some battles are fought without rifles, that some heroes don't wear medals on their chests, and that real strength often comes without shouting, only standing when everything else tries to knock you down.